Well, thank you very much, Keith, for the introduction and for the opportunity to come back and visit you here in Hamilton Road. It really is great to be with you and to have the opportunity just to explore these topics over the next 2 weeks. As Keith has mentioned, these are big topics, to say the very least. So how can I possibly do justice to these questions about the existence of God and related to that, the problem of evil or the problem of suffering next week? And the honest answer is that I can't. It would be completely impossible to do justice to both of these topics. But what I want to do is at least try to begin to share something with you that will hopefully provoke your own thinking on this subject as well, so that we can all grow in how we think about our faith and then how we might share it with other people too, to understand it ourselves and also to explain it better to others. So this week we're going to look at some reasons for the existence of God, and then of course the reasons against the existence of God as well, and that's what the focus will be for next week in terms of the problem of suffering. So I'm just going to go to the slides here and move through, but there we go. There are quite different perspectives that people can have when it comes to the evidence or reasons that we might have for the existence of God. Now, I don't know all of your backgrounds, but I suspect, given that it's Hamilton Road Baptist Church that I'm in, I suspect most of you will be more likely to go with the view of the Apostle Paul that I've represented in this slide, who says in Romans chapter 1 that, "For since the creation of the world, God's invisible qualities, his eternal power and divine nature have been clearly seen, being understood from what has been made, so that people are without excuse." And so the way you might think about this, and indeed the way you might think about a talk like mine this evening, will be to say, yeah, that's right. There's loads of evidence for God. There's loads of reasons for God. How could anybody think otherwise? But many people, of course, do think otherwise. And maybe there's some here tonight as well. I don't know. But if we take Bertrand Russell was a leading philosopher in the first half of the 20th century. And he was a very outspoken atheist as well. And so he was asked what he would do or how he would respond if he were to die and to find himself before God, in the presence of God, and be asked why he didn't believe. And he said, "Not enough evidence, God. Not enough evidence." Now the question is, how can we have such differing opinions? We all look at the same world out there. We observe the same world, the same features of the world, so how can we arrive at such different conclusions? I mean, if we have all the evidence, why don't we all find the truth, whatever the truth of the matter is? Now, you might have your own thoughts about that, and there might be multiple reasons why people will arrive at different conclusions based on the evidence, but perhaps you have sort of sensed that yourself, maybe talking to a friend, and you think, well, look, here are the reasons. Why can they not just see it? But of course, maybe at one time you were in their shoes, so maybe you understand why they can't just see it. So there could be a variety of reasons. There could be intellectual reasons. There could be reasons that are of a spiritual nature for having different viewpoints on this. But one of the reasons, one of the factors that might be relevant concerns the nature of evidence itself. So that's what I'd like to just explore very briefly first before we look at some of the reasons for belief in God. So what is evidence? Well, the first thing that you might say is, well, evidence is about what you can see, right? What you can see with your eyes, what you can observe, that's evidence. And that's true, of course. Seeing things can be a type of evidence. But of course, it's not the only type of evidence. We also can use our other senses. But even then, is that what evidence is? It's just what we can detect with our senses. Well, no, even that's too limited, too narrow a view of evidence. So we might say, well, it's what you can detect with your senses or what you can detect with scientific equipment. Is that what evidence is? Well, even here, I think this is too narrow, and it's too narrow even within science. So let's think about the dinosaurs. Now, this is not about science in the Bible. I'm not trying to discuss the age of the universe or things of that nature in this example. But what do scientists think happened to dinosaurs? Why did the dinosaurs become extinct? Now, they've offered various hypotheses as to why this is the case. The most prominent one, I'm sure you'll be familiar with, is asteroid impact. Okay? An asteroid collided with the Earth and basically wiped out a lot of animal life, including the dinosaurs. But other hypotheses have been proposed as well. So massive volcanic activity and various others, including climate change and so forth. So a whole bunch of different hypotheses have been put forward. But then how do you decide? What sort of evidence would be relevant to answering that question? And what would the evidence look like? Well, there seems to be a problem. I mean, if you think of evidence as being what you can detect with your senses, or what you can detect with scientific equipment, that won't really help here, will it? Because you can't observe. It's not as if we have some sort of video recording and can go back and look and see what caused the demise of the dinosaurs. Nor do we have any scientific apparatus that, we can do an experiment and the pointer will go one way, volcanic activity, or go the other way and point to asteroid impact. No, the evidence is much more subtle than that. And so what you find, going back to, I think it was 2010, there was a paper published in the prestigious journal Science, and a whole team of scientists amassed a whole load of data and said, well, look, the best explanation of all of this data is asteroid impact. Now, some other scientists disagreed, but you get the idea. It was by looking at the total range of the evidence and saying, well, what gives the best explanation of all of this? So we need to look at the relevant facts, and then what we need is a broader account of evidence than just what we can see or detect, even with scientific apparatus. It's about weighing up the evidence, just as we might do in a legal case, as the image here suggests. It's weighing up the evidence, the reasons for and against. Now, what's the point of all of this? Well, we need to distinguish, I think, between narrow conceptions of evidence and broad ones. So I won't go into all the details of this, but here's the gist of it. If someone comes along with a very narrow conception of evidence and they say, well, I want proof, science doesn't show there's a God, it's as if the person might be looking for some sort of scientific experiment that could test one way or the other, or some sort of scientific proof. And if that's the kind of concept of evidence, then you're right, there won't be much evidence for God. That's too narrow a concept. But it's too narrow approach to evidence even within science. So what if we take a broader approach to evidence, as we do within science, as we do within legal contexts, as we do in medical contexts, and elsewhere as well, historical contexts? If we have a broader account of the evidence, then what we can say is, well, let's look at a range of features of the universe we live in, or facts, and say, well, what is the best explanation of those facts? And so that's the approach I want to adopt. And so with that in mind, then let's consider two viewpoints that we want to compare. On the left side of the screen here, you'll see a naturalistic or atheistic perspective. And it starts out with the idea that matter, the material universe, is sort of fundamental. That's the starting point for explanation, and that explains everything within the universe, including ultimately minds like ours. The alternative viewpoint on the right, you'll see, reverses the order. It says a mind, an intelligent mind, is fundamental, the mind of God. God is the fundamental being, and He has created all the other stuff, all the matter that we find within the universe. Now, these two views could hardly be more different. And both have a long pedigree, right? I mean, it's not as if either of these views is just ridiculous. You will find great thinkers throughout history on both sides of this debate. And so what we're going to do is look at some features of the universe and see, well, where do they fit in? Now, what I'm going to do tonight is to look at some features of our universe that I would suggest provide evidence or pointers towards belief in God. The main obstacle, of course, is the problem of evil, the main reason that people might give against belief in God, and we'll turn our attention to that next week. Okay, so let's make a start. If you go back just over 100 years ago, Albert Einstein proposed his general theory of relativity. Now, what he discovered when he was working on it was that it seemed to require that the universe was either expanding or contracting, that it couldn't be just static. And yet the universe looked static. You know, when you look out at the night sky, and people, of course, have been doing this for a very long time, it was basically the same as it had always been. There was no indication that the universe had changed. And so Einstein was completely convinced that the universe was static. And on the basis of the scientific evidence available at the time, that's what it suggested, that the universe was static. So Einstein did what scientists shouldn't do. He fiddled his equations. He put in an extra term. I know it's hard to believe that Einstein did it, but anyway, he did. And that was to ensure that his equations predicted that the universe would be static. He later admitted that this was his biggest blunder, right? Because two other scientists, Friedman and Lemaitre, took his equations without this extra fudge factor that Einstein had put in, and they predicted or proposed that the universe was actually expanding. 1929, then, we have Edwin Hubble, who actually finds observational evidence that this is the case, that the universe was indeed expanding. Basically, the light from distant galaxies was distorted, which suggested that they were actually moving away from us. Now, the more the scientists looked into this, of course, they realized the evidence for this was very strong. And if the universe was expanding, then if you go back in time, it's shrinking, and shrinking right back to essentially nothing, which suggested a beginning. And as the late Stephen Hawking pointed out, many people do not like the idea that time had a beginning, probably because it smacks of divine intervention. Now, he's certainly right about this. That's exactly what happened. Many people tried to find ways of avoiding this idea that the universe had a beginning. Indeed, Hawking himself tried to do this. He proposed an alternative model, although he later admitted that it did actually end up having a beginning within it anyway. But that's another story, and we're not getting into the detail of that tonight. Now, various other proposals have been put forward, as I say, to avoid a beginning, but more evidence came along. Some of you might be familiar with the background microwave radiation, which basically disproved some of the alternatives to a beginning. And various other models have been put forward, such as the idea that the universe is expanding and contracting and has been doing this forever. But again, the evidence seems to count strongly against that as well. Now, does this prove that the universe had a beginning? Well, no, but based on the scientific evidence that we have, it certainly is strongly suggestive of a beginning. Now, what we can't do tonight is go into all the technical details and all the objections. Some of you might have objections relating to that, and that's fine. We can discuss that later if time permits. But what I would like to do, as well as just giving you a sense of the different arguments or reasons for belief in God, is to try to provide a brief summary of them in a statement like this one, so that you can get the core idea and then think about how you might make sense of that or explore it further yourself. So let's think of how we would put this as an argument. The first point is that whatever begins to exist has a cause. Now, this seems just obvious. Things just don't pop into existence uncaused out of absolutely nothing. And sometimes scientists will give the impression that it is possible, but, and again, we can pick up on that in the discussion if anyone wishes, but really, the idea that things can come into existence with no cause out of absolutely nothing, there's just no basis for this idea at all. And it's just intuitively obvious. This is precisely why some scientists have been keen to avoid the idea of a beginning. It smacks of divine intervention. If the universe began to exist, indeed, what the scientists were suggesting was that time itself had a beginning, which is ironic because, of course, that fits very well with Genesis 1:1 and with what Christian theologians had been saying for 2,000 years. So whatever begins to exist as a cause, the universe began to exist, and I've given you one of the reasons for that, this expanding universe. There are others. We don't have time to go into them, but let me just briefly mention one of them, the second law of thermodynamics. If you have children, you'll understand the second law of thermodynamics. Basically, things get more disordered over time unless there is energy put in to make it ordered again. So a child's bedroom very easily gets disordered. You don't need to go in and get them to disorder it for you. That just happens over time itself. Work needs to be done to get it back to an ordered state. The universe is like this as well. There is order in the universe, but if the universe had been around for an infinite amount of time, there shouldn't be order in the universe. There are also some logical reasons for thinking that the universe began to exist, but we won't take time to go into that. But let's look at these two key points now. Whatever begins to exist has a cause. The universe began to exist. Then it follows from that, point 3, therefore the universe is a cause. Now you might say, well, it has a cause, but what could that be? Well, let's think about that cause. It can't be part of the physical universe, because the physical universe is the thing that began to exist. It must be outside space and time, because space and time began to exist. It must be incredibly powerful to have produced a physical universe as massive as ours. And since there can't be a scientific, a physical explanation, well, arguably a personal explanation would be the other kind of explanation we could give for it. So potentially a personal explanation, something that's incredibly powerful, outside time and space, with no beginning itself, not part of the physical universe. It's beginning to sound like God. So that is the first reason, the evidence for the beginning of the universe. Let's move on to a second one, and this concerns the evidence for design within the universe. Whether it's at the subatomic level, whether it's at the large-scale structure of the universe in terms of galaxies and so forth, or whether it's somewhere in between at the level of life, and we look at the incredible complexity and machinery involved in all, what are the latest estimates, somewhere in the region of 30 trillion cells in your body, and every one of them a miniature factory, producing all the proteins required to support life. The basic point here is that no matter what way you look at it, the universe is just full of order. In fact, science is based on this fact. Now, somebody might say, well, do we need God or design to explain this order? Couldn't science explain this order? Isn't that what science is about? Well, what I would say is that, yes, science uses laws to describe this order. But then that raises the question, why is the universe described by these laws? Why is the universe like that? Now, if you go back to the founders of modern science, they had a very clear answer for this question. They were looking for laws precisely because they believed in a lawgiver. So, in answer to the question, why is the universe like this, naturalism or atheism gives us, I think, no reason to expect so much order in the universe. But if there is a God, this is just what we'd expect. It's what we expect when there's an intelligent creator, an intelligent designer at work. We expect to find order. And we've got loads of it in the universe. But I want to press this a little bit further and go to some more recent discoveries in science. Now, let me just pause here for a second. Back at the start, I mentioned Bertrand Russell, this very prominent atheist in the first half of the 20th century. Now, here's one of the things that has been quite interesting as a development. And so let me just mention this as a little bit of an aside. Back at the time when Russell was doing most of his work, the dominant viewpoint within philosophy, science, and other disciplines was atheistic. That was the main viewpoint. And really, reasons for belief in God were in short supply. But things have changed dramatically on this front. Now, I'm not saying everybody working in science and philosophy and history and so forth are all Christians. I'm not saying that at all. But what you'll discover happening since about the 1960s is some very powerful reasons being put forward for belief in God and for some of the central claims of Christianity by some of the leading scientists and philosophers and historians. There's been a complete change in this, so that even the most prominent atheists have to sort of sit up and take note of these reasons that have been put forward. And one of the reasons they need to take these arguments seriously is because some of them are based on our best science, such as this evidence for the expanding universe. Here's another one, that we live in a fine-tuned universe. Now, it's fine-tuned beyond belief. And it's not just one factor of the universe, but multiple. I mean, at least 20 or 30. Constants of the physical world or quantities that we find within the world that are just right for life. It's sometimes called the Goldilocks enigma. It's not too hot or it's not too cold, it's just right. In this case, just right for life. Otherwise, we simply wouldn't be here. So let me give you a couple of examples. The balance between the gravitational force and electromagnetism needs to be right to about 1 part in 10 to the power of 40. That's a 1 with 40 noughts after it. So 1 part in 10,000 trillion, trillion, trillion. What are the chances of getting that just by accident? And that's just one example. We can look at others. I'll briefly mention a couple of others. A cosmological constant, that goes back to Einstein's blunder. It turns out we do need a cosmological constant, but it has to be right to something like 1 part in 10 to the power of 53. If we go to the low entropy of the early universe, the order that had to be there in the early universe, the Oxford mathematician and physicist and Nobel Prize winner Roger Penrose has estimated that this needs to be right to something like 1 part in 10 to the power of 10 to the power of 123. I mean, this is just astronomical, doesn't even begin to describe this kind of number. Now, I'm not saying all of these directly translate into probabilities. There's a lot of discussion and debate about these areas, we don't have time to go into all of the details, but suffice it to say, what scientists are agreed upon is that our universe is quite remarkable. It's fine-tuned for life. Now, we're not saying yet as to whether it was fine-tuned by God or if there's some other explanation. Just this fact of the fine-tuning is agreed upon and not generally disputed amongst scientists. So let's just see a couple of scientists and what they've had to say about this. Stephen Hawking again says, were it not for a series of startling coincidences in the precise details of physical law, it seems humans and similar life forms would never have come into being. Or Sir Fred Hoyle, who was deeply opposed to this idea that the universe had a beginning, and he proposed alternative theories that turned out that they needed to be rejected, but he was really against it. But based on this evidence for the fine-tuning of the universe, he said a common-sense interpretation of the facts suggests that a super-intellect has monkeyed with physics as well as with chemistry and biology, and that there are no blind forces worth speaking about in nature. The scientific evidence drove him to that conclusion. You'll see a dartboard on the screen here, and you'll see that a bullseye has been achieved. Now, I don't know how good your dart playing is, whether it's as good as mine or not, how difficult you find it to hit the bullseye. If you look more carefully at the screen, you'll see that there's some marks on the wall behind it as well. I think we initially had the dartboard in the kitchen in our house, but my wife suggested we move it somewhere else, and you can understand why. I should say that those marks on the wall, those were all by my children playing darts, not by me. But anyway, you get the idea, the sort of precision that is needed to hit the bullseye. Now, one author writing about this fine-tuning says, well, if you think of a dartboard and you consider the Milky Way galaxy that we live in as being a dartboard, so that's about 100,000 light years in diameter. And then he says, imagine a bullseye that's about 1/trillionth of an inch in diameter. That's the sort of precision that is needed for life to be possible. And that's just for one example of the fine-tuning. Okay? So you get some idea of what is needed here. Now, what are the explanations for this? Well, some people will say it's due to necessity, that there must be some reason why the laws of nature, why all these constants are so fine-tuned. And maybe when we eventually get a full theory of the universe, a full theory of everything, it will explain that to us. But there's just no reason for thinking that this is the case. This is just a pure speculation. Furthermore, the best theories that we have within science don't come anywhere close to predicting what these constants should be. In fact, they'll leave us with something like 10 to the power of 500 different possibilities. So it doesn't help the problem of fine-tuning whatsoever. And furthermore, even if we did have such a theory, we'd still have to ask, well, why is the universe like this? That there is this theory that explains it all. Surely that would again point to some intelligence behind it. Chance as an explanation for this fine-tuning is just completely implausible. Nobody accepts that. And the reason for it is not too difficult to discern. It's just because the chances are so small. So here's an illustration that some other authors have given. So if you think of a box with mostly white balls in it, 999 white balls, let's say, and one black one. You're blindfolded and you have to choose one at random. It's very unlikely, 1 in 1,000, but you could do it. But now imagine a box with 10,000 trillion in it, and you do the same exercise. And if you get out the right one, what are you going to conclude? Just chance? Well, I don't think so. And if your life depended on it, which it does in this case, I think you would say, somebody must have planned this. Some people have appealed to a multiverse, the idea that the universe we live in is just one of vastly many universes, maybe infinitely many universes. So this is one of the objections that people have used. Now, there are some difficulties with this. One is that it's speculation. We just don't know about this. In fact, there's no way of detecting these other universes. And so some people have dismissed it as just being a completely unscientific approach. But even if it turned out to be right, this multiverse, these many universes, it would actually require design to produce enough diversity in all of the different universes for one like ours to exist. What does that leave us with? I think the obvious thing to draw, the obvious conclusion to draw, is that design provides the best explanation. I would say far and away the best explanation, indeed the only plausible explanation for the fine-tuning of the universe. We'll go on now to consider 2 further reasons for belief in God. And we're going to change gear here and to move away from the scientific context to think next of all about morality. So in terms of morality, morality is obviously a fundamental aspect of our human existence, the idea that there is right and wrong. And so this is something we're all familiar with. If you look at point 2 here, that there are objective moral values and obligations. So everybody has agreed, of course, that morality is important. And the thing about morality is it's not just about what we decide to believe or that we collectively impose or something of that nature. We're all agreed that it's not just our opinion that murder is wrong or that rape is wrong, but that they really are wrong, that they're objectively wrong. And so there is this objective dimension to morality about what is right and what is wrong. The question then is, granted that that's the case, and let me just emphasize that many atheists, the vast majority of atheists as well as religious believers, will affirm this about morality. That there really is moral rights and wrongs, and indeed will live in that way, will live morally good lives, or at least will strive to. I mean, who among us lives a morally good life? But they will recognize the importance of morality in their daily lives as well. But the question is why the universe is like that, why there is a moral order in the first place, or how we can make sense of it. And so here I think we run into a difficulty for the naturalist, because if all there is ultimately is the physical stuff of the universe, then where does morality come into the picture? There doesn't seem to be right or wrong in atoms colliding with each other. What happens is just what happens as far as science is concerned. And yet morality seems to come into the picture. Now, could it just be that we, when humans came on the scene, that we think about the sort of world that we want to live in, that we come up with rules or something like that for how we should live morally? But then the question is, but is it really wrong to murder, for example? Or is it just not a good idea? Or to put it another way, where does the obligation come from? Because when you think about the nature of morality, there is an obligation with it. It's not just that murder is a bad idea or it leads to bad consequences. It's that it's really wrong in this objective sense of the word, and also that we have an obligation not to murder. Furthermore, when we think about progress in morality, so some societies in the past practiced child sacrifice. Now, when we look back on those societies, do we think, well, it was okay for them? No, we want to look back and say, well, no, they really were doing something objectively wrong. I mean, whether they recognized it or not, it was wrong to do that, and we have made progress by not doing that anymore. And all of this presupposes the idea that morality is objective. But then if we go to the first point, if there's no God, there are no objective moral values and obligations. There is no ultimate basis or foundation for morality. Now, this doesn't mean that we need to get morality from the Bible. People who grow up never having read the Bible still have a sense of morality, a sense of right and wrong. The idea is that we need a foundation, a basis for morality. And that comes, I would say, from God, who is the source of morality. Morality is based ultimately on the character of God. It's grounded in the very way things are, in the very fundamental nature of reality, in the character of God himself. And so if these 2 points are right, then morality shows us that there must be a God. So morality is a further pointer to the existence of God. Let me come then to the final one, and this concerns a specifically Christian claim, the resurrection of Jesus. Now, I don't have time to go into all of the facts and evidence and so on relating to this, but let me just say this. Some people will say, well, this isn't really a reason for belief in God. You might give your reasons for belief in God, and then, if somebody believes in God, then maybe you can discuss whether Jesus rose from the dead or not. But actually, as I've looked into this, the more I've explored the process of burial and what took place in that regard, as well as early accounts within the Gospels about this. So that's the first part of the story. We have multiple accounts, and again, if you're getting multiple independent accounts, that gives you more reason to believe that the tomb was empty. And remember, an empty tomb could in principle be explained some other way. So the empty tomb is just a sort of historical fact. Furthermore, we know that the earliest opponents accepted the empty tomb. This was accepted by the earliest opponents of Christianity. And finally, it was discovered by women. Now, I'm sorry to say to the ladies here tonight that women weren't considered reliable witnesses, and yet in the Gospels we find that it's the women who discover the empty tomb. Likewise, when it comes to the appearances, so point 5 there, many people about how Christ died for our sins according to the Scriptures, that he was buried, that he was raised on the third day according to the Scriptures, that he appeared to Peter and to the 12. He goes on to say that after that he appeared to more than 500 of the brothers at the same time, and then he appeared to James, and then he appeared to all the disciples, and last of all he appeared to me. Okay, this was Paul's account. And so the historians looking at this will say this goes back right to the beginning, to within just a few years of the crucifixion. It wasn't an invention from much later or something of that kind. Let's take point 8. The message of the early Christians focused on the death and resurrection of Jesus. N.T. Wright, the historian and theologian, exploring all the evidence, says that there's no form of early Christianity that we know of that doesn't affirm that after Jesus' shameful death, God raised him back to life. This belief goes back right to the start. So all of this evidence removes a number of the objections that it was just a legend that grew up. The evidence goes right back. A conspiracy theory that the disciples stole the body, but the historical evidence shows that the disciples believed, they genuinely believed that Jesus had been raised from the dead. They didn't make it up. I mean, however else you might want to explain it. Or hallucinations. Well, again, these just don't stack up because they weren't expecting a resurrection. And indeed, if they had somehow had a vision or something of that kind, they would have said Jesus has been translated into heaven. They wouldn't have said that he's been resurrected, because resurrection meant physical resurrection. My time is gone, but the best explanation I would suggest for all this evidence is what Christians always believed, that God raised Jesus from the dead. Now notice, the Christians weren't saying Jesus rose naturally from the dead. Of course, that would be ridiculous. But if there is a God, then, as Paul said, why should any of you think it ridiculous that God raised Jesus from the dead? So, of these two perspectives, I would strongly suggest that the evidence we've looked at tonight sits very firmly on the right-hand side. We've considered 5 different reasons that I think are much better explained by the viewpoint on the right, that there is a God who has created our universe. And as Paul said, he hasn't left himself without testimony. He has provided plenty of testimony in the universe and in history for us to believe in his existence. Okay, so I'm going to stop there and hand back to Keith, and I'll be back with you next week to look at the main objection.
David, don't go anywhere. If anybody has a particular interest, what couple of books, websites, resources would you be pointing them to off the top of your head?
Well, I didn't prompt this question from Keith, but I do have another slide there that just has some...
Two great intellects up here, David.
That's it. So some books there that definitely are worth a look at. William Lane Craig, a couple of books by him. John Lennox has quite a number of books that you will find helpful. And the last one on the list there just recently come out, a sort of big weighty tome by Douglas Groothuis, I think he's called, on Christian apologetics. So definitely worth a look at that one. Craig's site, Reasonable Faith. He's got loads of good resources, including podcasts. You'll find great material there. And earlier Keith mentioned Paul Coulter. So I've been working with Paul a little bit in the context of the Center for Christianity and Society, and you'll find some resources there as well. That's sort of growing over time, so hopefully you'll find more there as well in the near future.
Super. Well, I'm sure all of us have had our minds stressed this evening, and 3 good things to go away and think of the reason for God. And hopefully that will come into conversations that we have with friends and family throughout these coming days as well. I'm certainly wishing that some friends I have were here to hear it. It has been recorded, so it is going to be available online. So if you do have friends who are asking questions about the very existence of God, this is going to be available for you online.